Your Royal Highnesses, honored guests, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've been enjoying your Abu Dhabi hospitality, and we did a little sightseeing today. We saw the Grand Mosque, which is quite magnificent. And I've been learning a lot about your country and city. I think Abu Dhabi is making the right kinds of investments. I'll talk a little bit about what those are. But I'd like to expand on Dr. Kaku's presentation. I think it's a very good introduction. We should talk together more often because I'd like to give you a broader perspective. I believe these things are going to happen. Many of them are underway already. Why is it happening now? Why didn't these things happen 50 years ago or 50 years from now? What is the pace of change? Where does it come from? It didn't come from nowhere. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense of the history of technology and why we are now entering really the most exciting phase of human history. And I became interested in this because of my own interest in being an inventor. That's what I have always thought of myself to be since the age of 5. I remember my parents gave me lots of enrichment toys, things like erector sets, lots of toys with lots of little parts. And I assembled all my parts in different rows, and I had lots of different things I could put together. And then I went through the neighborhood and brought back radios and bicycles and took them apart. And I had this big inventory of things I could put together. And I had this idea that if I could just figure out how to put them together in the right way, I could create transcendent effects, magical effects. I didn't have that vocabulary at age 5, but I can remember the feeling very well. And I remember other kids were wondering what they were going to be, a nurse, a teacher, a fireman. And I always had this conceit, well, I know what I'm going to be. And I've kept that interest for over half a century. But I discovered 30 years ago that the key to being successful as an inventor was timing. And it turns out timing is important in everything in life. In investments, professional work, your personal relationships, you have to be in the right place at the right time. And so I began to study from a scientist's perspective, what can we predict about the future? And I had the idea, which is still a common assumption, that you cannot predict the future. The future is unknowable. But I thought maybe if I studied it, gathered a lot of information, I could make some reliable predictions that would help me to make sure my inventions made sense not for the world I saw in front of me, but the world that would exist 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now when the project's finished. And that will be a very different world. I mean, think back now, 3, 4 years ago, people didn't use social networks. Look at how influential they are today. Wikis like Wikipedia, blogs. 10 years ago, most people didn't use search engines. That sounds like ancient history. That wasn't so long ago. The world changes very, very quickly. And if your project's going to take a while, it has to make sense for that future world. So I gathered a lot of data, and I made a very surprising discovery. If you measure the basic measurements of information technology, the kinds of technologies that Michio was talking about, they actually form very predictable trajectories. You can actually predict where the power of computers will be, the power of communication technologies, now the power of biological technologies, which are becoming information. And that was really very surprising. And not only is it predictable, but what's predictable is that it grows in an exponential manner. It doubles every period of time, depending on what you're measuring. The overall power of a computer right now is doubling actually in less than a year. And even that rate is getting faster and faster. If you look at computers 100 years ago, it took 3 years for them to double in power for the same cost. In 1950, it was 2 years. In the year 2000, it was 1 year. Now it's 11 months. But even just doubling every year is pretty fantastic because there's a very profound difference between exponential growth and linear growth. Now, linear growth is like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's actually what our intuition tells us. The reason we have a brain is to be able to predict the future. So when our ancestors walked through the field 1,000 years ago and they saw, oh, there's an animal going that way, I'm going this way, we're going to meet up there, I don't want to meet that animal, I'm going to go this other way, turned out to be good for survival, to be able to predict the future. That became hardwired in our brains. But those predictors that are hardwired in our brains, are what we call our intuition, is linear. That things are going to keep going at the same pace. But the reality, not of everything, but of information technology, is that it doubles every period of time. Instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it goes 2, 4, 8, 16. Now you might think, well, it doesn't sound that different. But a linear progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at step 30, you're at 30. 2, 4, 8, 16, an exponential progression, at step 30, you're at 1 billion. And this is not an idle speculation about the future. This is several billion times more powerful for the same price as the computer I used when I was a student. It's 100,000 times smaller. So when I came to MIT, in fact, I went there because it was so advanced in 1965 that it actually had a computer. And thousands of us shared this one computer. It took up half a building, cost tens of millions of dollars. This is thousands of times more powerful. And we will do that again in the next 25 years. This will then become the size of a blood cell. It'll be 1 billion times more powerful again for the same price. And it gives you some idea of what will be feasible. And that is actually a very predictable trajectory. And so I've been making actually predictions based on this. I didn't start a week ago. I started 30 years ago. In 1981, I had a number of the curves that I will show you showing this exponential progression, very smooth, of computers, of communication technologies. So I saw the Internet, which wasn't called the Internet. It was called the ARPANET, for the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense in the United States. And it was just set up to allow Defense Department scientists to communicate with each other. There are only a few thousand scientists in the whole world who were using the ARPANET, but it was doubling every year. And for various reasons, I was quite confident that would continue. So I said, wow, this is going to be a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people around the world to each other and to vast knowledge resources. And people thought that was nuts. It got a lot of criticism. The entire American defense budget can only tie together 2,000 scientists. So maybe someday there'll be hundreds of millions of people. That's going to be hundreds of years away. But that is, in fact, exactly what happened because of the power of exponential growth. In 1990, the Genome Project was announced. This was not a mainstream project. A few renegade scientists actually saw that this was progressing exponentially. I agreed with them, and we all felt that it would take 15 years. But mainstream scientists said there's no way you're going to sequence the whole human genome in only 15 years. Because in 1989, we only collected 1/10,000th of the genome. This is going to take centuries. Halfway through the project, the skeptics were still going strong because only 1% of the human genome had been sequenced. So they're saying, okay, 7 years, 1%, it's going to take 700 years, just like we said. My reaction was, no, we're almost done. Once you get to 1% in an exponential progression, that's only 7 doublings from 100%. 1% a year later would be 2%, then 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. 7 years later, it should be finished. And that's exactly what happened. And as a result, health and medicine is now an information technology, as Dr. Kaku talked about, and I'll talk more about that. And this exponential pace of information technology is fueling an acceleration. It's making things go faster and faster, particularly the impact of technology on our lives. The very first invention in human history was a communication technology. It was called spoken language. We could actually tell stories to each other. That took hundreds of thousands of years to evolve. The second invention was written language, so we could actually write down and record our message and actually write down human knowledge. That took tens of thousands of years to evolve. Then we invented the printing press. That took 400 years to reach a mass audience around the world. The telephone reached a quarter of the U.S. population and a very good portion of the rest of the world in 50 years. The cell phone reached a quarter of the worldwide population in 7 years. Today there are more cell phones than people in the world. Social networks, wikis, blogs, search engines, the personal computer, those reached a quarter of the population in 3 years. So there's a continual acceleration. Things are getting faster and faster because of this exponential growth. So I'd like to show you just a few examples of this. I have now a team of 10 people that gathers data in different areas of information technology. We have hundreds of these graphs. I'll show you just a few examples of just how amazingly predictable this is, even though you would think that it would be very unpredictable. So this is the first graph that I came up with. I had it through about here, 1980, in 1981. Each of these dots is a famous computer going back to the 1890 American census. And this is not just Moore's Law. Moore's Law says that we can put twice as many transistors on a chip every 2 years. They run faster, so it's actually a doubling in power every 1 year. But that only pertains to chips, which started actually in the 70s. This goes back several generations earlier, long before we had chips, long before Gordon Moore was even born. And what was amazing is how smooth a progression this is. Now, this is a logarithmic graph, meaning what we're measuring, which is the power of computers per $1,000, constant $1,000, expressed in an exponential manner. So as we go up the graph, we're multiplying by powers of 10. So every level on this graph is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. A straight line on a logarithmic graph is exponential growth. And you can see it's actually a curve. It's better than exponential growth. So it looks like a modest little curve, but this actually represents trillions-fold improvement in the amount of computation you can get for the same cost. That's how we're going to get these penny per chip computers. That's just a calculation by continuing this curve into the future. But what's really amazing is look at how smooth the progression that is. It's extremely predictable. And as an example, in 1980, I completed this curve. Now, none of these computers existed at that time. And as the future has unfolded, all of the computers that have come out have been on that curve. It's been very predictive. I had this curve in 1980. I extended it to 2050. We're now at 2012. And it continues to be very predictable. But it's quite revolutionary. This is a several billion-fold increase in the power of computers since I was a student. And it's going to give us billions more capability in computers and every other example of information technology as we go forward. So I don't want to dwell on these examples of electronics, but this is the cost of a transistor. When I was a high school student, I would hang out in New York City. I would go to the surplus electronics shops. They're actually still there. And I'd buy something this big, which was a telephone relay that could switch 1 bit of information, and it cost $50. Then I was excited in 1968 I could buy a transistor, which was much smaller and faster, for only $1 that did the same thing. Today you can get billions of them for $1, and they're faster again. The cost of a transistor cycle has been a very smooth exponential down, being basically half as expensive every year. That's a 50% deflation rate. And this is true of every form of information technology. You want to buy 1 million instructions of computation. You want to send 1 million bits wirelessly. You want to send 1 million bits on the internet. You want to sequence 1 million base pairs of DNA. It will cost you half as much today as it did a year ago, a quarter as much as it did 2 years ago, 1,000th as much as it did 10 years ago. That's actually deflation, and that's actually what's holding inflation in check. Economists actually worry about deflation. In the worldwide depression we had in the 1930s, we had massive deflation. And the concern is, if you can get the same stuff now for half the price of what it cost you last year, okay, you will buy more. That's an economic rule that comes out of the price supply curve. But you're not going to double your consumption because you only need so much. So maybe you increase your consumption 50%. Therefore, the size of the economy is actually going to shrink as measured in constant currency. But that's actually not what we see. I mean, here's bits of memory shipped, but I could show you 50 other graphs like this. We actually more than double our consumption every year. And in fact, the total amount of currency consumed by information technology has increased 18% per year, every year for the last 50 years, despite the fact you can get twice as much of it each year for the same cost. And the reason for that is as price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode. I mean, why didn't search engines take off 20 years ago? Just because nobody thought of it? Nobody thought it was important? The price performance didn't exist. As price performance becomes feasible, things like iPhones suddenly explode, or digital music, or any of the other applications once they become cost effective. And this is actually what's fueling economic growth around the world. So Time magazine had a cover story on this idea. They said, hey, we want you to put this particular computer that we covered in the magazine a few weeks ago on the graph. I said, well, it may not be on the curve. It's not going to be above the curve, but it might be below, because sometimes computers come out that are below industry standard, and then they don't survive in the marketplace. But indeed, it's the last point there. It's right on the curve. This is a curve that I fashioned, extended 30 years ago. It remains remarkably predictable. This here is the number of bits we move around wirelessly in the world. So a century ago, there was Morse code over AM radio. Today, it's 4G networks. And this is a logarithmic scale. Every level on this graph is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. And again, you might think that this would be very erratic, because if you read the headlines, multi-billion-dollar telecommunication company goes bankrupt, new auction of spectrum space, one country accuses another of dumping products. You would think that given the unpredictability of human behavior, that this would be very erratic. It's amazing how smooth these curves are. The internet data traffic, this basically shows a doubling every year, the number of bits we move around on the internet. Here's that graph that I had in the 1980s. I had the first few points here. This was called the ARPANET. So I predicted it out and said this is going to be a World Wide Web of hundreds of millions of people by the late 1990s. And that's exactly what happened. This is the same data, but this is not a logarithmic scale. This is a linear scale. And this is actually how we experience the world. So to the casual observer, it looked like the World Wide Web just came out of nowhere. But you could actually see it coming. And this is actually the main advice. I do some mentoring now of young companies. And we actually have those companies, okay, write down in your business what are the parameters that affect your business. Like right now, I have a company that does e-books. And so we're concerned about the resolution of displays and the power of mobile computing and telecommunications. So we will actually write down what those technologies will be like 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And even though I've been doing this for 30 years, I'm surprised. Wow, telecommunications is going to be that different in 2 years? You really have to actually write it down and compute it in order to really anticipate it, because a lot of business plans that I read assume that the future 3 years from now, 5 years from now, it's going to be just like today. Maybe cell phones will be a little smaller. But we just don't have the imagination unless we take this discipline. But these trajectories are very predictable. So biology, I mentioned the total amount of genetic data has doubled every year. It's continued past the end of the Genome Project. The cost of Sequencing DNAs come down by about half every year. And basically, we are learning the software of life, and that's not a metaphor. It's not an abstraction. There are literally little software programs running in our body, 23,000 of them. They're called genes. And we actually have the technologies now to change them. How long do you go without updating the software on your phone? This is probably updating its software right now as I speak. But I'm walking around with outdated software that evolved thousands of years ago. For example, I have one gene, and I bet you have it too, called the fat insulin receptor gene. Basically says, hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. And that was a very good idea 1,000 years ago. You worked all day to get a few calories. There were no refrigerators, so you consumed your prey, and then it stored it in the fat cells of your body. And that was a good idea then. I would like to tell my fat insulin receptor gene now, you don't need to do that anymore. I'm confident the next hunting season will be good in the supermarket. And so that was actually tried near where I work in the Boston area, the Joslin Diabetes Center. They turned off that gene. We have technologies that can turn genes off, like RNA interference. So they turned off that gene, and these animals ate a lot. They ate ravenously, all they wanted, and they remained slim. And it was not a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes. They didn't get heart disease. They lived 20% longer. They got the benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. And they're working with a drug company to bring that to the human market. There are genes we've identified that are needed for cancer to progress or heart disease. There are genes we'd like to add, and we have techniques to do that. For example, I'm working on a project where we take cells out of the body, lung cells, scrape them out of the throat. These are in patients who have a disease caused by a missing gene. Now, most people here have that gene, but if you're missing that gene, you will get a fatal disease called pulmonary hypertension, where the life expectancy from diagnosis is about 1 year. And really, all they're missing is this one gene. So we take one of their cells in a petri dish and add that gene, inspect in the special microscope that it got done correctly. Then we replicate it millions-fold. So now we have millions of cells with the patient's own DNA, but with the gene they're missing, inject it back in the body, goes through the body, ends up back in the lungs, and this has actually cured this fatal disease, and it's undergoing successful human trials. These are just a few of the hundreds of examples where we're basically reprogramming our biology. My father had a heart attack, 1961. It damaged his heart, so he could hardly walk. In fact, 50% of all heart attack survivors have a damaged heart. It's called heart failure, low ejection fraction. And the heart does not fix itself. Today, you can actually get these stem cell therapies and have that fixed by rejuvenating the heart with your own heart cells that have been programmed to basically rejuvenate the heart. And we're going to be, as Dr. Kaku mentioned, growing new organs. There's no longer a problem with embryonic stem cells because we can take our own skin cells and create the equivalent of an embryonic stem cell by adding 4 genes. They're called induced pluripotent cells. And the ethicists who are opposed to embryonic stem cell research because it involves embryos support this type of work because there's no embryos. And if you need a new kidney or a new liver, you'd like it to have your own DNA. So these are just a few of the ways in which we're treating health and medicine as an information technology. And the significance of that now that it's an information technology, it's going to progress in this exponential manner. These technologies are getting twice as powerful every year. That was not the case using the old method, which was really hit or miss, just accidentally finding things that work. So if I want to send you a music album, a few years ago I would send you a package and you get a box and you'd unwrap it and there was a music album. Today I can send you an email attachment with a link or with files to download, and I can send you music as an email. If I wanted to send you a book a few years ago, I'd send you a package. Today I can send you an email attachment. I can send you a movie as an email attachment. Well, now I can send you a violin as an email attachment if you have the three-dimensional printer, and this is not a future technology. Exists today. This is a real violin that was printed out on a three-dimensional printer. This was on the cover of a recent issue of The Economist magazine, and professional violinists have played it, and it plays quite well. Somebody printed out an airplane, one module at a time, and snapped it together and flew in it. I have a university I started with Peter Diamandis. It's sponsored by Google, and NASA, the American Space Agency, gave us a campus in Silicon Valley. And the students do team projects. One of the projects is to use three-dimensional printers to print out housing, whole houses for the developing world that are very high quality but low cost, printing them out again one module at a time and snapping them together. This is ultimately going to revolutionize manufacturing. Right now, we're kind of right before the storm. It's like before search engines or before digital music. Not all the capabilities that we want are in place, but it's improving very rapidly. The costs are coming down. The resolution and fineness of features are increasing. You can already print out quite complex objects with these three-dimensional printers. And, of course, we can print out whole organs, printing out the scaffolding with a three-dimensional printer and then actually populating it with the necessary stem cells, as you saw in the video, to actually grow any organ in the body. This will be applied to medicine. Here we see these are little robotic red blood cells. Our red blood cells are little devices. They store oxygen and carbon dioxide. They release them in a certain manner. This is a device that's designed to do the same thing, but it's 1,000 times more powerful. And a calculation was made that if you were to replace a portion of your red blood cells with these little robots called restaurocytes, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. And so, honey, I'm in the pool will take on a whole new significance. I was asked by ESPN, the sports magazine in the United States, we're going to ban these, right? Just the way we ban steroids. And I said, probably not. We should ban steroids because steroids are bad for your long-term health. So if you don't ban them, you're forcing athletes, in order to be competitive, to do something that's damaging to their long-term health. So there's a moral reason to ban them. And the fact that we don't actually enforce that very well means we actually do have that problem. But this is actually good for your health. You could have a heart attack and you'd have hours to get to the doctor. It will lead to better oxygenation of your tissues. So let me talk a little bit about a project that I've been very interested in, actually for 50 years. I started thinking about this when I was 12. How does the human brain work? And how can we actually copy its methods and create artificial intelligence and then use that artificial intelligence to make ourselves smarter? And I've been thinking about that for 50 years. And we're already making progress in that. Just using a search engine makes us smarter. The fact that I have a device in my pocket that I can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes makes me smarter. Ultimately, we will continue to get smarter, and we will ultimately put them inside our bodies to make ourselves healthier. They'll go inside our brain. They'll put our brains on the internet. But even if we just carry them in our pockets, they are making us smarter. And we really have not been able to see inside the brain with enough clarity to tell how the brain worked. There are MRI machines, and so Dr. Kaku showed you a picture of what happens when somebody lies, and you see certain things lighting up, and we can tell certain things, from which area is active. So we'll look at someone, and if they're looking at a loved one area lights up. If they're looking at something that's scary, another area lights up. It kind of tells you where things are happening, but it doesn't tell you how it works. But the precision and resolution of brain scanning has also been improving exponentially. Different kinds of brain scanning. We can now actually see inside a living human brain with enough precision to see individual interconnections being formed. And what we've always thought poetically, we find now is actually true. Not only does our brain create our thoughts, but our thoughts create our brain. As we think about things, we're actually creating new connections. And so it's said you are what you eat, but it's even more true that you are what you think. So you should, in fact, be careful who you hang out with and what ideas you're exposed to, because we are creating connections in our brain. We're creating our brain with everything that we are exposed to. And I'll give you, in just a few minutes, a brief summary of how the neocortex works, which is the part of the brain where we do our thinking. It constitutes about 80% of the brain. Only mammals have a neocortex, and it's biggest in a human being. Our primate cousins, like chimpanzees and monkeys, have a neocortex too. It's almost as big as humans. It doesn't have this big forehead with this frontal cortex. It gives us more neocortex. That was enough for us to create science and art and literature and all the technology, all the grand creations of humankind. And the neocortex basically is a pattern recognizer. It recognizes patterns. And so consider, for example, that letter there. That's the letter A, and has a little crossbar in it. So I've got 300 million pattern recognizers, and most of them are trained to recognize certain patterns. At a very low level, they're recognizing very simple patterns. So I've got a bunch that are just trained to recognize crossbars, like the crossbar in that capital A. So I look at that, and that pattern recognizer lights up and says, aha, I found a crossbar in a capital A. I've got other pattern recognizers that recognize other parts of the capital A. They feed up to a higher level. See, I'll show you that. So at the lowest level, I have different pattern recognizers that are recognizing these different parts of a capital A. It goes to the next level, and there's a pattern recognizer that goes, aha, a capital A. And that goes to an even higher level, and that recognizes the word apple or the word pear, depending on what else I see in the environment. These pattern recognizers are organized in hierarchies. That's a key part of the neocortex. It's really the only brain structure that's organized in this hierarchical manner, and it can recognize any number of levels of this hierarchy. So what happens if we go up, more levels, 50 more levels? What kind of patterns are we recognizing there? Well, we recognize things like, oh, that's beautiful, that's inspiring, that's scary, that's funny. Now, you probably think that those recognizers that are recognizing these abstract qualities must be much more complicated than these simple ones. They're actually the same. They just exist at a different conceptual level. Now, where do these connections come from that tie these different recognizers together in this pattern? We're obviously not born with this. I wasn't born knowing English, and there are languages I don't know, which I can't recognize. We learn this. That's part of the human paradigm. To get from being a newborn baby to a 20-year-old that actually can command language and can recognize that things are beautiful takes a long time. And a key strength of the neocortex is that we can create these connections ourselves. In fact, we have to. We're not functioning human beings if we don't create them. And that's the essence of the theory. And I talk about how we can relearn things, how we can keep our mind open, because actually by the time you're 15, you've completely filled up your brain. So if you want to learn anything new after age 15, you've got to actually forget something that's old to be able to learn something that's new. And this technique, it turns out that the techniques we've evolved in the field of artificial intelligence are very similar to what goes on in the brain. And it's not because we were copying the brain, because we couldn't actually see inside the brain until just recently. But those are the techniques that seem to work. Biological evolution discovered the same thing. So in the few minutes I have left, I want to talk about the impact of all of this. Technology, as I mentioned, is progressing in an exponential manner. It's getting more and more powerful. It's progressing faster and faster. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Now, I think there's a lot of optimism here in Abu Dhabi. As I travel around the world, the opinions are mixed on this issue. Some people think the world is getting worse, and they think technology is responsible. Things were much better. People were happier before technology kind of wrecked our lives. I think that's kind of a romantic notion. I think people who say that don't really know what life was like 200 years ago. You can read writers in English, people like Thomas Hobbes or even Charles Dickens, describe what life was like 200 years ago when life expectancy was 37, when there were no social safety nets, not because people weren't liberal enough, but because there wasn't enough money to go around, and life was extremely difficult. But I actually have about 50 graphs like this. I'm going to just show you one example of what has happened to humanity over the last 200 years. So these little circles are countries. The ones that I know about this is China. You might actually, I'm going to show you then what happens over 200 years. You might keep an eye on China because it does some interesting things. And we're going to look at these countries on two dimensions, health and wealth. So wealth is income per person, and this is measured in American dollars today. So actually 2009 American dollars. So the income per person on average was in the hundreds of dollars. People were quite poor in general. There is a range. There were wealthy countries and less wealthy countries. There's an income disparity, but nobody was very wealthy at that time. On the y-axis, its health is measured in life expectancy. So most people lived into their 20s or 30s. The worldwide average was 37 in 1800. So what happened over 200 years? So this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Machines were being introduced. It started in the English textile industry in Britain. Other countries started experimenting. As we get to the 20th century, the 1900s, you'll see a wind that carries all these countries towards the upper right-hand part of the graph, towards greater wealth and greater health. And at the end of this process, there's still a disparity between the wealthiest countries and the less wealthy. But the countries that are worst off are much better off than the countries that were best off at the beginning of this process. And it's not the end of the process. In fact, it's speeding up. As these technologies continue to grow exponentially, this is going to continue to move towards greater health and greater wealth. We see the same thing in education. We are destroying jobs at the bottom of the skill ladder and creating new jobs at the top of the skill ladder. And the new jobs have to do with creating knowledge and creating information. They require more education. They pay 10 times as much in constant currency as the jobs that are being eliminated. And we're investing more in education. That's certainly true here in Abu Dhabi. If you look at American statistics, we're spending 10 times as much per child in constant dollars on K through 12 as we did 100 years ago. In 1870, there were 50,000 college students in the United States. Today, there's over 10 million. And if we look at worldwide education, the number of years of schooling that an average child receives, okay, this is the developed world and this is the developing world. There's a gap, but they're both moving in the right direction. We've tripled the amount of education a child gets in the developing world. We've doubled it in the developed world over the last 50 years, and that's continuing to move in this direction. So all these different measures of considerations that are associated with human happiness, education, health, wealth, are moving in the right direction because of this progression in information technology. And in my view, it's going to get faster and faster because of the exponential growth of these technologies. Now sometimes people say, well, if people are going to live longer, we're going to run out of resources. We actually have plenty of resources if we can untap their power with the same technologies. They're going to extend human longevity. Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, and I did a study for the National Academy of Engineering in the United States on energy. We analyze different energies. So this is energy methods. This is just one example of solar. The cost per watt is coming down very quickly because we're applying nanotechnology to solar power. The total amount of solar power is doubling every 2 years. It's now actually only 7 doublings from meeting 100% of the world's energy needs. But this is just one example. There are new energy technologies that use fossil fuels that can extract it inexpensively and with no environmental impact. There's many different ways in which we can harness energy, and we actually have thousands of times more energy than we need to meet all of our needs with these new technologies. The same thing is true of water, new food production techniques, housing, using things like putting houses together using three-dimensional printing. We'll have plenty of resources for an expanded population. So this is the progress we made in life expectancy. It was actually less than 20 thousands of years ago. We've quadrupled life expectancy in the last 1,000 years. We've doubled it in the last 200 years. This is before health and medicine was an information technology. This is just from the hit or miss process of finding things that happen to work. Now that health and medicine is an information technology, this is going to go into high gear. And it's not just living longer, it's living better, overcoming many forms of suffering, being able to stop and reverse aging, and also just improve other parameters of life. And so I'm sometimes asked, what is my advice for preparing for this future world, for individuals, for cities, for countries, societies? I would make a few observations. First of all, it's very much an interconnected world. No society can just say, well, we're going to take care of ourselves. And, we see people are concerned about what's going to happen in Greece. I mean, in 2008, I happened to be traveling around the world in October. And within 1 week, every industry in every country was affected negatively, but it shows that everybody is connected economically. And that's going to continue to be the case. The best investment are twofold, education and in future technologies. And I'd make 2 points about education. One is it's not just for children. Of course, it's very important to educate children, but the old model where we'd educate kids and they learn a trade, to be a carpenter, a policeman, maybe a nurse, and then they just do that for 40 or 50 years and then retire. That model is already obsolete. People are going to have to continue to learn new things because the pace of change is going to be so rapid. So education needs to be a lifelong pursuit. And the best way to learn is to actually learn from doing. The old model of education, where we just sort of stuff facts into kids' minds, is also obsolete because we carry the facts in our pockets. What children and adults need to learn is, how do you find the right information? How do you apply that information? How do you actually solve problems in the real world using all the information that's available? How do you create new information? And the best way to learn that is to actually try to do it. I mentioned Singularity University, which I started, is backed by Google and NASA. And the main philosophy we have is that the students actually do projects. They take on big problems, like solving the water problem for the world, or disease, or housing. And the goal is, in fact, for these projects to continue long after the students have left the university. The goal is to actually positively affect 1 billion people within 10 years. And the idea is then to apply these exponentially growing information technologies to solving these problems. Now, many of these projects are, in fact, underway and are doing very well, like applying three-dimensional printing to developing housing for the developing world and other important areas. So some of these projects really will succeed in helping these grand challenges of humanity. Others may not succeed in that, but they'll learn something anyway. If I think about what I've learned in my life, some of my projects have been successful, others have not been so successful. I've learned from all of them. And in fact, that's where I've learned what I know today is from actually trying to do things in the real world. And there's a version of that that can be brought into education at every level, including elementary school and certainly college level. We see college kids starting great companies like Google or Facebook. And I think the tools of creativity are now in everybody's hands. But I think the investments that are being made in Abu Dhabi in education, in the technologies of the future, are the right approach. I think if we all continue to invest in these areas, we'll see a very bright and happy future for humanity. Thank you very much.
كل الشكر والتقدير للسيد Ray Kurzweil. You can have a seat, please. We'd like to welcome again on stage Dr. Michio. والآن ندعو المتحدثين لاستقبال أسئلتكم. يرجى تدوين أسئلتكم على البطاقات الموجودة على مقاعدكم وتسليمها إلى المنظمين. For our English-speaking audience, please write down your questions on the cards provided on your seats and give them to our volunteers around this stage. Again, I'd like to thank you for being here and giving us this amazing kind of insight on what to expect in the future. This first question we have here is for Dr. Kaku. How can you stop or slow down global warming using these technologies, and how far are you from a time machine?
Okay, well, global warming, I don't think can be easily reversed. Mm-hmm. We've tried to look at carbon sequestration. Some people have talked about shooting missiles into the clouds to darken the atmosphere. Personally, I think it's going to be difficult. We have to change the way we produce energy on the planet Earth. Now, solar power is dropping in price, as Ray mentioned. I think in 5-10 years, it could be very competitive. Right now, solar power is more expensive than fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. But I think in the next 10 years, there will be chaos in the energy market. Now, beyond that, beyond 10 years, we have a non-polluting source of energy, which is fusion power. The French and the European Union are investing 10 billion euros creating the ITER fusion reactor, which uses the power of the sun, fusion from the sun, hydrogen fusion. The basic ingredient is seawater. Seawater has hydrogen, and you can burn the seawater to create electricity. Mm-hmm. However, maybe 10 years, 2019, it is supposed to become operational. To make it commercial, take another 10 years. So minimum of 20 years before we have fusion nuclear power plants. But that is non-polluting, no carbon dioxide being created. It's unlimited. That is, we use seawater as the basic fuel. The problem is it doesn't exist yet. So it's a dream. But if the French and the European Union dream pays off, we could have almost unlimited energy almost for free. And that would then cure the global warming problem.
Mm-hmm. I'd make a comment on that. As I mentioned, I did a major study of different energy sources for the National Academy of Engineering with Larry Page, and we looked at different scenarios. A number of them, which are already working at some level, can more than meet our energy needs. For example, solar, there's 10,000 times more sunlight that hits the Earth than we need to meet all of our energy needs. We need to capture 1 part in 10,000. That certainly will be feasible within a decade, and the total amount is doubling every 2 years. But there's also scenarios involving oil and fossil fuels of being able to capture that with no environmental impact, ultimately also at low cost. And those also have thousands of times more potential than we need. You can go down a mile or two this way. Geothermal is a tremendous amount of heat inside the Earth. That can be turned into energy. There's a whole set of different scenarios, any one of which could meet our needs actually thousands of times over, in a clean, renewable way that does not release gases like carbon dioxide.
Okay, great. I think it's very important to realize that some of the things you talk about, which might seem like science fiction to us, but these are, some of them are already in the beginning stages and they are actually developing, like the Google goggles, for example, the glasses. This is, I guess, a question for both of you. Will the development in technology create a larger divide between the rich and poor countries? This touches upon what you were talking just about.
Well, sometimes you hear that. I think all the evidence is that it is actually eliminating the divide. Take Asia as a very good example. Many societies there were very poor agrarian societies, which basically used old-fashioned farming methods 20 years ago, and today have thriving information economies. The developing world actually has a higher growth rate than the developed world today. Africa has a much higher growth rate than the United States. And technology is coming in. Internet is becoming quite common. 30% of Africans have cell phones. Most of those will be smartphones very soon. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to more information and knowledge than the President of the United States did 15 years ago. There's right now very high-quality education being put online for free from the best educational institutions of the world, so anybody with an internet connection can actually access the best education. So I think there's tremendous potential ultimately to overcome the have-not divide. And if you look at the economic statistics, that is happening. It doesn't happen overnight, and at any one point in time, there is a divide. If you looked at my education graph, the amount of education we're giving children is increasing everywhere in the world, but there is a divide. And the divide stays there, but both developed and developing nations are moving in the right direction.
Also, developing nations can literally leapfrog into the future. It took decades to wire America and wire Europe. Today, we don't have to wire these cities. We can simply go wireless. Plus, the European cities and the American cities have an aging infrastructure. The subway system in New York City, where I live, is 100 years old. In London, it's even older than that. Beijing has a brand new subway system, leapfrogging over the European and the American nations. So the advantage there is clear. However, I think there's also a warning there. The world economy is making a slow but historic transition from commodity capitalism to intellectual capitalism. Those nations that are stuck in certain commodities like food could see their wealth gradually disappear. Food prices are extremely low compared to historic levels. This morning, you had breakfast that the King of England could not have had 100 years ago. Think of what you had for breakfast. The King of England could not have had these delicacies from around the world. That's how cheap food is historically from the past. So those nations that put all their eggs in agriculture without investing in information, without investing in entertainment and software, they could see their national wealth get smaller and smaller. Other nations like China have taken advantage of this. They send their students overseas, where I see them. The Caspia program in China takes the top scientists, the cream of the cream of the cream of the cream, and they send them to the United States. I'm part of the Caspia program, and I see these physicists go back to China to create a laser industry, a microelectronics industry, a biotech industry from nothing. From nothing. These people are sent to the United States, go back to China to create whole industries.
Wow. This is a question for you, Dr. Michio. A question from Haidar Al-Ansari. He says, when do you think we will witness the transition from type 0 civilization to one like Flash Gordon, type 1?
Okay. We physicists rank civilizations by energy, and a type 1 civilization is planetary. That is, they control the weather, they control earthquakes, they control volcanoes. That's type 1. Then there's type 2, like Star Trek, where they control the energy of a star or a few stars. That's like the Federation of Planets. Then there's type 3, which is galactic, like the Empire of Star Wars. So on that scale, what are we? Do we play with the weather? Do we play with stars? Or do we play with galaxies? We are type 0. We get our energy from dead plants. However, you get a calculator, and you calculate at what point will we use up all the energy that comes from the sun. It's a very simple calculation. It's about 100 years. And you can see the beginnings of a type 1 civilization every time you open the newspaper. The birth pangs of type 1. A type 1 language is being created. The two major languages on the internet are English and Mandarin. Type 1 sports with soccer and football and the Olympics. A type 1 economy with NAFTA, the European Union. A type 1 youth culture with rock and roll. A type 1 high culture with Chanel and Louis Vuitton. And so we're seeing the beginning of a planetary civilization, and local cultures will exist simultaneously. We will be bilingual. We will have the local culture, and we will have the planetary culture, and we will go back and forth between the local culture and the planetary culture. But we're about 100 years from being a fully type 1 civilization.
Okay, you got your answer then. This is a question to Mr. Ray, and I guess both of you can chip in. Do you think that the word culture will disappear, given that technology will dissolve geographical boundaries?
Well, I think, and actually building on what Michio just said, we see a world culture emerging which has as its input all of the different cultures of the world, because people now can communicate with people that have common interests all around the world. And I see children in the United States communicating with people in Africa and the Arab world and China, and making friends with them and understanding their culture and appreciating their music. And if you look at musical interests, it's definitely being influenced by everything going on in other musical cultures. So we have a worldwide culture because we have worldwide communication already. And I think that needs to be based on tolerance of appreciating the beauty and wisdom of many different cultures and different histories and different ways of looking at the world, which I think can only make our world richer. But we truly have world communication now, which is bringing about a world culture which is very rich and diverse, and will continue to expand in diversity.
Also, wherever I go speak around the world, I meet a bilingual elite. The elites are fluent in English or a European language and the local culture. That's today, we have a bilingual elite. In the future, we'll be bicultural. There will be a planetary civilization. You can see that every time you just open the TV and you see the Olympics, the beginning of a planetary culture. But the local cultures will live forever. They'll live forever on the internet. The culture, the language, the artwork will be stored forever on the internet, and local cultures will flourish and interact and enrich the planetary culture. So just like the elites of today are bilingual, in the future, everybody will be bicultural.
Okay. One last question, because we're running out of time, for Dr. Michio. How vulnerable are we of using technology? Do we have enough protection?
Enough protection.
Yeah, so I'm assuming...
Well, technology is a double-edged sword. It
Yeah.
depends on who controls the sword. Take a look at the development of nuclear weapons. On one hand, nuclear bombs can destroy society. On the other hand, well, maybe with fusion power, we'll have clean, cheap, inexhaustible, unlimited amounts of power through fusion. But the key is more and more democratic debate. The key is everyone has to be part of this discussion.
Definitely.
And as democracy spreads, wars are lessened. No two democracies have ever warred with each other in history. All the great wars of the past have been between dictatorships and monarchies. So as democracy spreads, I think wars will also be lessened.
Okay.
I've actually written quite a bit about this double-edged nature of technology. One of the chapters of Singularity is called the deeply intertwined promise versus peril of GNR, which is genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. And a very good example is take biotechnology. So we talked today about how biotechnology is going to enable us to reprogram our biology away from cancer and away from heart disease, good things. The same technology could be used by a bioterrorist in a routine college bioengineering laboratory to take a flu virus and reprogram it to be more deadly, more communicable, more stealthy, and create a super weapon and create a great deal of destruction. And it's a complicated, so some people actually have called for a relinquishment. Let's not pursue advanced technology at all because of these dangers. I've written that that would be a bad idea because basically it would just drive the technologies underground where they'd be even more dangerous. I think what we need to do is actually recognize the problem and develop defenses against that. I've actually worked with the U.S. Army on that, and we have today a rapid response system where if someone tried to do what I just said, we would detect it very quickly. We can now sequence a biological virus in one day. HIV took 5 years. SARS took 31 days. We can now do it in one day, create a medication against that, RNA interference medication or an antigen-based vaccine in one day, and within a few days have an antidote. So we could talk all day about the technical details of that, but society needs to put a high priority on keeping these technologies safe. Fire kept us warm, but also burned down our villages. Technology has always been a double-edged sword. I think we've benefited more than we've been hurt, but we actually have to focus our priorities and energy on keeping these technologies safe and preparing for defenses against people who would be irresponsible.
Okay, well, thank you very much again for being here and answering our questions. With
that, we come to the end of our session, and we would like to thank you for attending and participating, and we hope to meet soon in future sessions of the Muntada organized by Sheikha Salama bin Hamdan Al Nahyan Foundation.